I'll be presenting this paper on behalf of all of us, but we'll chip in, all four of us, for the question and answers and the discussion. It's a pleasure to see everybody here, and I really look forward to the debates we're going to have over the next couple of days. Before I start, really this conceptual paper is an attempt to develop ideas that were first set out by my co-authors, by Nathalie, Ramona and Amandine in their 2019 special issue. My feeling's always been that they made what I think is this really seminal contribution to the debate about contemporary European politics, which is they identified the way in which we've traditionally thought of sovereignty conflicts in Europe as being essentially this long-standing battle between national states, nation states, and claims made by supranational institutions. And that's really been, as they've written at length, that's really been something that has shaped the way EU integration theory has developed as well. What they did, I think, a couple of years ago was to really take a very innovative step and to say, well, in actual fact, if you look at these sovereignty conflicts, you find that they really take place within member states as much as between member states. And I think that was a crucial, very simple, but sort of good ideas are always very simple, a crucial sort of twist in the way that we think about sovereignty in the European Union. So this paper, is really just developing these ideas and trying to take them in different and new directions. The paper that we put together, this conceptual paper, I think we are really making two sorts of claims, and I'll sort of try and discuss each one in turn. One is what I would sort of think of, and this is the way that we present it in the paper, is really a logical argument. What we try and do in the paper is to connect what we identify as an emerging discourse around shared or pooled sovereignty, very prominent in the 1990s and into the 2000s. We try and logically connect this discourse around pooled sovereignty with the conflicts of sovereignty that we identify as being a feature of contemporary European politics. I'll go into that in a bit more detail, but there the claim that we're making is that you can derive in an analytical fashion out of the discourse of shared sovereignty or pooled sovereignty the conflicts of sovereignty that we're interested in, that we look at in an empirical way. That's one of the claims that we make in a paper. It's really a logical and analytical point that we make. The second one is to give some sort of historical context for these conflicts of sovereignty. That is to say, to address the questions of novelty, of continuity, to provide some sort of historical narrative, I suppose, into which we can situate these sovereignty conflicts. As you'll see when I sort of go into describing this, any sort of historical account that kind of gets boiled down into the length of just a paper is always rather cursory and rather superficial. So there's plenty more. I can see some nods there. Yes, cursory and superficial, but we do sort of point to ways in which this argument can be developed. But for the purposes of the paper, we sketch out what, if you like, is a historical narrative that can then be fleshed out in a lot more detail. So let me try and go through the paper in the way it's really presented. The first point, I think, and maybe some of you have sort of this on the tip of your tongue, it would really be a mistake to present any sort of collaboration around the theme of conflicts of sovereignty in Europe as new. It's almost sort of obvious, I suppose, that the concept of sovereignty has been riven with debates, discussions, competing definitions, competing accounts, and also really goes to the heart of modern democracy and the kind of conflicts that we associate with that from, I suppose, the late 18th century onwards. So we're not really suggesting that what we've identified is something that has never existed before or is new. Rely on a number of authors, some of them may be known to you, some of them may not. There's a recent work by a former colleague of mine at Cambridge, who's now at Yale, Lucia Rubinelli, and her work on constituent power really begins, it's a book on constituent power, and the first thing she says really is that ever since this concept was first developed in a French revolutionary tradition, there has been an enormous debate about who the constituent power can claim to be and where that power lies. And she generalizes that point to discuss the contested nature of sovereignty. We also make reference to the work of Pierre Rosanne Vallon, and in one of his really great books, Le Peuple Introuvable, he begins by saying the concept of sovereignty in the sense of an idea of popular sovereignty, an understanding of the people, has been from the very beginning an abstract concept that has needed to be filled in sociologically. And the 200 years following the first sort of emergence of this tradition as an abstract idea has been about who, sociologically speaking, really is the people. So it seems fairly compelling, I think, that there are long-standing debates and conflicts around sovereignty. What we try and do is we say that there has been a certain sort of settled consensus, if you like, and I use the word consensus extremely loosely, around the concept of sovereignty within the Western European tradition in the post-1945 era. If you're interested, look at the paper, and there's a lot more to be said about this, but we argue that some of the really deep divisions in European politics prior to 1945 can be understood as conflicts, for instance, between parliamentary versus popular sovereignty. Some of the difficulties around the sustainability of the Weimar Republic was precisely a conflict around sovereignty. And we argue that the legal positivist tradition that emerged out of this era in some way settled this question by dissolving the concept of sovereignty into legal structures, into law. It had the framework of the national state, but rather than identifying in any sort of class or social sense the identity of the people, it was devolved into the force of a legal order. And that gave a certain stability to the concept of sovereignty. We also point out that there was also a post-1945 class compromise, which we understand as this corporatist Keynesian post-war state, and that also lent stability to the politics of that era. And so we say that the contemporary conflicts of sovereignty can be understood as emerging out of the unraveling of that particular consensus. So that's sort of a historical claim, I suppose, that we're making. Now, the transition point for us in terms of, I suppose, sort of concepts and theory is that we have this concept of shared sovereignty and pooled sovereignty. And that for us is a sort of a, discursively at least, a transitional point from the settled notions of sovereignty instantiated in the legal positivist tradition to the contemporary conflicts of sovereignty that we see today. Now, can I just say a word about shared sovereignty and how it's connected to conflicts of sovereignty? We developed this point at some length in the paper. I was trying to practice this presentation this morning, and the point was actually quite difficult to get across. So bear with me. I'll see if I can get this point in just 2 or 3 minutes. The basic argument that we're trying to make in the paper is that the discourse of shared sovereignty was never very successful at differentiating between the principle of sovereignty and the manner in which sovereignty is instantiated in a given political system. And what it tends to do is actually to confuse those two things, but we think it's rather different. So the tradition of shared sovereignty, pooled sovereignty, I know that in the literature there is some attempt to clearly distinguish between shared and pooled sovereignty, but we treat it as a common discourse. What it does is it makes a virtue of the absence of any sort of hierarchical claim to sovereignty. It makes a virtue of a lot of competing claims at different levels and argues that plural quality of sovereignty claims has the advantageous effect of cancelling out any sort of dominant claim, any sort of dangerous majoritarianism in particular, and you get a more legitimate and more functioning political order as a result. What we argue is that, especially insofar as some of that discourse refers itself back to this earlier Madisonian federalist tradition about the way branches of government compete with one another in order to cancel out the dangers of a dominant sovereign authority, we argue that actually, going back to that particular federalist tradition, the distinction there in the Federalist Papers was very clear between the principle of sovereignty and the manner in which it was institutionalized. The principle was one of popular sovereignty, and the innovation of the Federalists was to actually conceive of something known as, well, what they thought of as the American people. However, the manner in which that was institutionalized was through the doctrine of the separation of powers. But we argue that the principle of sovereignty lends itself to federal polities as much as it does to very politically centralized polities. Those are two separate questions. One is the principle itself, and the other is how is it translated into institutions. The problem with the discourse about shared sovereignty, that made no real distinction between principles of sovereignty and the manner in which it's institutionalized. And it made a virtue of competing claims to sovereignty as if that took us back to this earlier sort of Madisonian era. But in actual fact, it simply validated conflicts, genuine conflicts about where the final authority lies. And so what you get is a rather messy picture that lays the terrain very much for the kind of sovereignty conflicts that we then discuss in a more recent era. So that's the attempt to make the connection logically. Now, I'm aware that Julia's going to give me a sort of a hand signal at some point when it comes to my 3 minutes, and I've not really covered the historical explanation. Let me just try and put that in a brief way, if I can. What we say in the paper really is that if we want to understand the contemporary conflicts of sovereignty, there are three drivers, if you like, historical drivers that we identify. And we stress in the paper, we don't really think of these as sort of independent variables in that sense. I think that lends a slightly sort of too much weight to the argument, and it's not really the way we approach it. We think of it as drivers that chronologically at least overlap with one another and are stretched out over quite a long period of time. But the three drivers that we are interested in are the expansion and the scope of European Union integration. The second one is what we describe as a crisis of political representation in Europe. And the third one is what, to use shorthand, might be the rise and fall of neoliberalism, or at the very least, the changing role of the state in its relationship to the economy and to the market. And we think that these three factors are really important in understanding the contemporary conflicts of sovereignty within the European Union and the way in which they create divisions and disagreements internally to member states. The first point, which I'll kind of summarize really quite quickly, is that insofar as European integration can be understood as a process that has fairly fundamentally transformed European states at the national level, that transformation has big implications for the way sovereignty exists, both as a relationship and a practice within states. The phrase that we cite there is a phrase by a really great article by Vincent della Sala back in 1997, where he described European states as becoming hard but hollow. Okay, 3 minutes. Hard but hollow. And that has an important sort of impact on the distribution of power within a state towards the executive, away from the legislature, with implications for the way we think about sovereignty. So that process of European integration has been very important. The second one is a fairly obvious point, I suppose, which is the extent to which anti-establishment populism has emerged as a phenomenon, a really existing phenomenon within Europe. It pits us, the people, versus them, the elites. It utilizes the claims, the language, the doctrine of popular sovereignty in opposition to what it thinks of as a political cartel. So it's mobilized the language of sovereignty in a very conflictual way. So it seems fairly intuitive to see how a crisis of political representation and this process of repoliticization, or the return of mass politics to Europe, has driven or has exacerbated, brought out conflicts of sovereignty in Europe. The third one is a point which I think is important, and we make it only briefly in the paper, is sovereignty is about power. You can't really have conflicts of sovereignty if there is not the exercise of power. And insofar as the shared sovereignty discourse was also associated with the retreat of the state vis-a-vis the economy, then this age of sort of deregulated markets was not really an age where you would have claims about sovereignty made vis-a-vis interventions in the economy. But if we accept that there's been a process of a return of the state as an economic actor, not just this year in the context of the pandemic, but a slightly more longer-term development in European politics, we've seen it over the last few years, then the questions of sovereignty will pose themselves because the state begins to exercise power over the economy. And the question then is who has the right, on whose authority, etc. So the more interventionist the state, the more likely you're going to have conflicts of sovereignty once again. So I think more or less my time is up. That's sketched out some of the logical claims we make in the paper, some of the historical claims we make in the paper. Looking at the other papers, I think there's a lot of dialogue we're going to have between them, and I really look forward to the Q&A and discussion after the presentations. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Chris.